Welcome to Sex Ed with DB. I'm your host, DB. Let's get into it. Here's something we just don't talk about enough. Pain with sex is super common. Up to 3 out of 4 people with vulvas report pain during intercourse at some point in their lives. That's most of us. And yep, I personally have been there. There are lots of possible causes, and lube isn't a magic cure for everything, but I will say this. Using Uberlube makes a huge difference for me. It's silicone-based, long-lasting, doesn't get sticky, and it's made with sensitive bodies in mind. It also doesn't stain my sheets or clothes, so it's one less thing to worry about. I literally keep multiple bottles all over my house and the Good To Go Traveler in my toiletry bag because running out is just not an option. If you're ready to bring more comfort and more pleasure into your sex life, go to uberlube.com and use code SEXEDWITHDB for 10% off. I'm going to say something that sounds wild. Using a magic wand every day might actually support your health. I tested it. I did a 21-day masturbation protocol. Yes, protocol, where I tracked stress, sleep, mood, confidence, even how connected I felt to my partner. The results were so striking that we scaled it up into a legit scientific study with over 1,000 people with vulvas. And here's a spoiler. The benefits went way beyond, quote, I had great orgasms. We're talking emotional well-being, body confidence, relationship connectivity, and a lot more. You can read the actual findings yourself. Head to magicwandstudy.com and see how pleasure is showing up as wellness. Welcome to the Lalo anatomy lesson you won't want to miss. Ever heard of the A-spot, aka the female prostate? It's a deep erogenous zone located on the front wall of the vagina about 2 inches deeper than the G-spot. And that's exactly where Lalo's Enigma Double Sonic goes. It simultaneously stimulates your clit, G-spot, and A-spot using deep sonic tech that literally sends sound waves through your body. When folks ask me about blended stimulation, this is one I point to because it covers all 3 zones. Think a full symphony for the vulva. Want to get the toy loved by millions? Head to lelo.com now and use code SEXEDWITHDB for 15% off and give your A-spot the standing ovation it deserves. Hello. Welcome back to Sex Ed with DB. I'm DB, of course, your favorite sex educator and pleasure expert. And today we have a little bit of a different episode for you. Before we jump in, I want to give some quick content warnings. Today's episode is a conversation with consent coach Mia Schacter. In this episode, we're going to touch on consent violations, including some examples of what that can look like, and our experiences with consent violations. And to be frank, there is a lot in this conversation that I don't agree with. Some of the conversations around consent might be especially troubling to listeners who have dealt with consent violations in the past. If the zeitgeist commentary around things like Amber Heard being an imperfect victim have been triggering to hear, for instance, this episode might be a difficult listen. If you have to take a step back and not listen, there's absolutely no judgment here. Your emotional health and safety are more important than an episode of a podcast, I promise. And in this episode, you will hear me push back on some of what Mia brings up. We'll talk about this more in the afterglow for this episode, but just to give some context, I want to bring up a model of consent that we reference, that Mia is not really a big fan of, but that I personally am a fan of and teach when I go into middle school classrooms. And that is the FRIES model, which is an acronym for consent that gives quick pillars of what consent can look like. And here's what it spells out. F, freely given. Consent cannot be coerced, forced, or pressured into. If it's not freely given, it's not consent. R is for reversible. Consent can be withdrawn at any point. Consent is an ongoing conversation, which means at any point if you want to stop what you're doing, you're allowed. I is for informed. Consent means that you know what you're getting into. This is another part of consent as an ongoing conversation, and it's based on having correct and accurate information. If someone says that they're going to do something like use a condom, but then they don't, that is not something you gave consent to. You were not informed. And that's actually called stealthing, which is illegal. E in fries is for enthusiastic. This is where my and Mia's disagreement comes from most in this episode. Planned Parenthood defines enthusiasm in the fries model like this. When it comes to sex, you should only do stuff you want to do, not things that you feel like you're expected to do. Enthusiasm doesn't have to mean you're jumping for joy. It just means that you're doing something that you want to do instead of doing something you feel like you're supposed to do. S in the fries model is specific. Consent is given for specific actions. It doesn't mean that any kind of activity is okay. Consenting to kissing someone isn't consenting to them touching you under your clothes, for instance. And while the fries model isn't perfect, I don't think it needs to be. I think it does exactly what it's supposed to do. It's a quick way to get across some information that can help a lot of people as a jumping off point. And there's definitely something to be said about what enthusiasm means when it comes to consent. If you're asexual but not sex repulsed, enthusiasm can look different than it does for someone with a high level of sexual attraction or libido. If you have responsive desire, which Mia brings up, enthusiasm can look like curiosity or can be something that needs a little waking up first. But I think what's most important about enthusiasm and consent is not feeling pressured to be someone that you're not or do something that you don't want to do. You can still be enthusiastic about trying something that you're unsure of. You can be enthusiastic and still be a little nervous or scared. You can be enthusiastic in a way that's more like a chill thumbs up than applause and confetti. So yeah, all of that being said, I want you to take into account that, again, it might be an awkward conversation for you to hear. There are many points where I am disagreeing with Mia. And yeah, I want to make sure that you're informed and that you know what you're getting into. And you might be thinking, if I'm disagreeing with them so much, why am I platforming this person? And I think that we hear some rhetoric coming from Mia that a lot of people espouse. And I think it's that much more important that we challenge those things that we hear that we don't necessarily agree with so that we're able to have as productive of a conversation as possible. So that's the reason why we're playing this episode today. With that out of the way, let's get into this conversation with Mia Schacter, and be sure to stay tuned for the afterglow for more. I promise you're going to want more from me after this episode. Here we go. Welcome, Mia Schacter, to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I am absolutely stoked to talk about pleasure and consent and education and kind of the intersections of those things. So thank you so much for being here to lend your expertise. And I'd love to start with the quick and dirty, which is our rapid fire segment where we get to know our expert with bold questions and honest answers and just enough spice to kind of get things going. So I would love for you in a few sentences, or a sentence if you can, since we're doing it quick and we're doing it dirty. Can you define enthusiastic consent for us?
Well, this may shock you, but the requirement of enthusiasm in consent is very much on its way out and outdated. It comes from Planned Parenthood's acronym FRIES, which is freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And even Planned Parenthood knows that the requirement of enthusiasm is not working and is kind of actually causing a lot of issues within consent. It's creating binaries that are really harmful. I'm happy to go into it more later, but I don't use the word enthusiastic in consent and when I teach it. So we now talk about engaged consent, embodied consent, the idea of like being present and being aware rather than this requirement of like anything other than an enthusiastic yes is a no. I've written a lot about my beef with the requirement of enthusiasm.
Great. I mean, this is a rare thing that we hear in the sex ed field. So I'm happy to hear a different perspective for once in our GD lives. This is interesting. We definitely will get into this a little bit later, but thank you.
Sure.
What's the most common thing that people get wrong about consent, would you say?
I think there's a lot of things. I think the thing coming to mind most immediately is that consent is one person's responsibility in a dynamic, and that often gets snapped to a gender binary, which is exclusively then for, heterosexual couples. So the idea that like one person is responsible for consent and the other person is responsible for saying yes or no creates a really bad environment for engaging in the practice of consent in an ongoing way.
This is good. Less of a one-way street, more of a conversation.
Yeah, and a shared responsibility.
Yeah. What's one great way that someone can check in about consent before sex?
Well, I have some thoughts on that, but I fear that question suggests that consent is something that you can do in a moment, as opposed to something that is ongoing. Because
let me rephrase. Let's assume that we're checking in during sex as well. But this question is specifically a before the clothes come off conversation. What does that conversation look like?
Well, I'll take a bit out of my partner's playbook and offer just asking like, what kind of sex do you want to have tonight? Simple,
effective.
Yeah. And like fun, because then you get to go like, ooh, I don't know. Let's talk about it. Yeah.
Ooh, what kind of sex do you want to have tonight? I like that. That's great. Okay, the last question for the quick and dirty. In one sentence, what does the overlap between consent and pleasure look like to you?
I can answer that question by saying that at the beginning of my work as a consent educator, I was really interested in helping people say no. And over the years, I've become increasingly interested and passionate about helping people find their desires and ask for what they want.
Ask for the thing that they're really excited to say yes to.
Yeah.
I think that's great. I think that that's a great actual metaphor for sex ed as a topic, because I feel like a lot of us growing up, at least I'll speak for myself. I've talked about this many times on this podcast, but my sex education really just looked like STI education and pictures of, scary pictures of STIs and, basically like drug and alcohol and nutrition. And that was kind of it. That was the trifecta: STIs, drugs and alcohol, and nutrition.
Well, and when we were kids, I'm assuming we're like close enough in age that it was largely about HIV. Like, all through the 90s and early 2000s, it was like so much fear about HIV. And I often think of the gym sex ed teacher from Mean Girls, where he's like, if you have sex, you will get an STI and you will die.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, I've been rethinking about our merch because I have a shirt that like on the back of it, it says like, if your sex ed looked like this, and it like points to a dumpster fire, like you need sex ed with DB. But on the front of it, I want to get like that still image of Coach Carr spelling chlamydia, K-L-A. I think like, to your point about like, instead of learning when to say no, like figuring out what your yes is. Of course, like no is an important part of consent too. But my point in saying that is that there was so much opportunity when we learn growing up what you're going to want to say no to. You're going to want to say no to STIs. You're going to want to say no to being under the influence because that's really scary, and like all of these things, rather than
unprotected sex.
Like, yes, exactly. Yeah. Like these are the things that you're going to want to say yes to. You're going to like fingering. You're going to really like kissing. Like there was never any sort of thing like that in middle school. And So I really like this idea of figuring out not only what people's boundaries are for the no, but what their most comfortable self looks like in the yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And there's no learning to talk about sex and pleasure and what you want if the majority of your consent education is really framed in the negative.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. So let's get into the meat and potatoes here. I would love to hear you define consent, like in your own words. If enthusiastic doesn't feel good, what does consent look like for you? And I would love to hear like an example of what giving consent and or asking for consent looks like in these frameworks.
Sure. I define consent as an ongoing practice of what I call full body listening. So, for more than just the words that someone's saying, but also how they're saying it. And then using all of that information to move forward, even if it means, changing course. So, yeah, dealing with all of that information and considering it as important, listening very deeply, and not just to the other person, but to yourself. I think of consent as a path towards knowing yourself. We've touched on it a little bit, but like knowing what you want, what you don't want, what your limits are, what your curiosities are. And I think that's where I would start with, pushing against this requirement of enthusiasm. I think that requiring enthusiasm, first of all, leads to a lot of like fake enthusiasm. A lot of what looks like enthusiasm is just people pleasing. Enthusiasm looks different for everybody. But one of my biggest hangups around enthusiasm is that if you've never done something before and you want to try it, you're curious, you want to learn something new, possibly stretch your own limits, like see if you're capable of something, see if you like it, or if you don't, requiring enthusiasm doesn't make space or doesn't leave space for any of those complex feelings around like nervousness or hesitation or like, I want to try this, but I'm scared and I'd like to move slowly. Like if someone is saying to you, like, well, you don't really seem enthusiastic, so I think we shouldn't do that because of what I learned in, remedial consent education or in my anti-sexual harassment college orientation, then we're teaching people to dictate what other people get to explore or not. You don't get, there's not a lot of room to try new things. And also for so many people, myself included, the first time I had sex, I don't think I was what anyone would call enthusiastic. I honestly wanted to have done it. Like I wanted it to have already happened, And so like, yeah, I was dating someone I liked and like, wanted to do it with, but I didn't have familiarity with like the sensation of like, I want to have sex because I had never had sex. And it made me nervous. It made me scared. And like for anyone from the outside to then tell me that according to these rules, that was not consensual, I think that's pretty fucked up.
So if you maybe had gotten more language around, hey, this is a really complex thing, and you might feel one thing 1 minute and another thing another minute. And if your general disposition is that you're wanting to explore and you're interested in this thing, but you have a moment of kind of nervousness, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not consenting. Is that kind of what you're painting the picture of?
Yes, both for yourself and the other person. So like if someone says, like if I was like, do you want to try this particular thing? And they're like, oh, I don't know. Then you have a conversation about it. But in this oversimplified consent education where enthusiasm is absolutely required or it's a no, then if someone says to you, I don't know, in order to keep yourself safe and out of trouble with giant air quotes, you're just going to go like, oh, well, then we shouldn't do it. And then you're robbing the other person of agency and autonomy and like self-knowledge, if they're saying, well, I'd like to try. And you're like, well, no, I was told only to do something if you're enthusiastic. It creates this very black and white thinking, and we all start dictating for each other what someone else's experience is or was in the moment or in hindsight.
This is really interesting because this is actually bringing up for me like where people are currently at with this. Like where most people are at is that to me, this is like a level 3 conversation when like ideally it would be level 0 or level 1 and everyone would be able to understand this nuance. I fear that maybe this is infantilizing people's abilities, but I'm specifically thinking about boys, people who are socialized as cis boys. I wonder if do you see it as like enthusiastic consent is the first step to talking about these things, just so folks, including cis boys, are capable of respecting other people's boundaries in full before the harder, in my mind, again, this like level 3 conversation comes up? Or do you see all of these conversations happening in tandem? Like, can you speak to, I guess, kind of this piece that I'm talking about meeting people where they're at?
Yeah. I try to be very careful assuming that cis boys are not experiencing the same kind of pressure to perform and be interested and available and excited for sex. I know so many in my own life who have themselves felt pressured, often by girls, to, if they don't get an erection or they're nervous or hesitant or scared, or they aren't, ready to go at the sight of a boob, that there's something wrong with the girl, and like that's her fear. And then so he will push through his own boundaries to perform excitement, desire, confidence, like experience that he may not have. I think I've seen, like, I went to a rave and there was a list of like consent rules, and I saw, any touch should be like enthusiastically received. And I thought, okay, this is like one of the very few instances where I think this is a positive. Because if you're like rubbing up on a stranger in a crowded dance room, yes, someone should be like, yes, do that. Like, I am into that. You should not assume that like the absence of a no is a yes in a situation like that. But when we're talking about dating and romance and exploration and, learning what you're into sexually, especially for teens, I think not leaving room for the presence of hesitation, fear, like sex is scary if you've never done it before. And even sometimes when you have, and these, what I call bumper sticker education, which is like no means no, anything other than an enthusiastic yes is a no. It reduces consent to like a checklist and like a set of rules. And it does not encourage conversation, asking questions, listening, slowing down, creating options. And it also does not encourage us to, there's like, I call that whole idea of like, you shouldn't be having sex if you can't talk about sex. Like, I call that abstinence light. Like, how are we supposed to learn to talk about sex without having sex? like without learning what we like. And especially when we have like such pathetic sex ed and consent education, like how do we think people are going to, especially young people, are going to learn to talk about this like with their hands in their pockets, you know?
Yeah. This is so fascinating. I think obviously this is a deeply nuanced conversation, and there's so much room for, just like thinking and disagreeing and just like what this looks like in practice. And I think it's so, like I think I agree with you in that the bumper sticker, like sex ed are platitudes that are often unhelpful seeming, but I think that I have been surprised at how much those platitudes have impacted people who really got nothing, which is why I'm interested in this idea of kind of like, maybe it's like platitudes are level 1 and then it's like,
right. I mean, we're not going to like be able to do away with, you know, if you Google whatever, like you're going to get these sort of buzz terms. So it's not that I think we need to like rid the world of them. It's that I think we just need to do better at providing accessible and digestible and age appropriate, you know, deeper conversations. I will say, like, you know, I work in the field of consent education. I am close friends or colleagues with quite a few consent educators. And the ones that I'm in touch with, like we all know and agree and have seen in so many different ways the failure of enthusiasm as like a blanket requirement, and also its limitations, and also the damage that it really is doing to communities. Like it's like truly resulting in a lot of you know, schisms within communities. I can go into that more later if you want. But
can we go into that now? I'm curious what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, so I've done a lot of writing on this where like when cancellation happens around consent violations and sexual harm, very, very often what has happened is that there was a misunderstanding or a lack of clarity or unclear or unknown boundaries or different definitions of sex. You know, someone said they didn't want to have sex and they meant like including oral, manual, whatever, and the other person thought they meant penetrative. And then what happens is that for any reason, someone is left feeling not great about the encounter after the fact. It might be that the sex was bad. It might be that they, you know, slept with someone they think they shouldn't have in hindsight, like a friend's ex, or they cheated on a partner. And what happens is this requirement of enthusiasm becomes this kind of like fine-tooth
like a marker
comb,
or something,
a magnifying glass where people look through the encounter for the moment where enthusiasm was not totally present. And then they point to that as why the encounter wasn't consensual. And it's a way to avoid accountability, like a way to avoid responsibility for the choices that you made. And that can be really hard to hear for anyone who's actually experienced sexual assault or rape, myself included. And I think that behavior, while I understand a lot of where it comes from, is ultimately like quite a slap in the face to people who have experienced real sexual assault or violence. Because what's really going on is that someone feels regret. And regret is a very powerful emotion that often suggests that someone is to blame for something that went wrong. When a lot of times regret means like, I just learned that I don't like something and I don't ever want to do it again. Or I learned that I wish I hadn't had sex with that person. Like I made a mistake. I feel really bad about it. Or now my friend is mad at me because I slept with their ex. Or now my partner is mad at me because I cheated on them and I regret what I did. And looking for this like needle in a haystack of like, well, I wasn't totally enthusiastic because I hesitated there, or I said I didn't want to and then I changed my mind. Like I do see this a lot. I hear about it a lot. And it's honestly, it's not just like frustrating. It's heartbreaking, because to me, this is like a gross misuse of consent, which ultimately I believe is about autonomy and liberation and pleasure and desire and connection. Consent is like a tool for connection. And I see it get misused in this way. And I often find that enthusiasm.
And sorry, the misuse is, could you spell that part out for me a little bit more? Is the way in which people regret instead of...
The misuse is like using consent to figure out who's to blame and who to punish.
I see.
For something that, was like unpleasant all the way to regrettable for any number of reasons, not because there was pressure, coercion, force, violence, like anything like that, but because you like made, maybe like a moral error or a judgment error. And you just are like, I wish I hadn't done that. And then consent gets misused to figure out who is at fault, when very often no one's at fault. And that gray area is really hard to live in.
This is really tough. I think I'm thinking about this though in two buckets. Okay. This is how I'm thinking about this. Mm-hmm. There's the bucket where I'm thinking back to like experiences that I and many, many other women and queer non-binary people have experienced when they were just coming up in their like sexual debut, where like so many men that I hooked up with pushed, like we're trying to physically push my head to their crotch when we were making out, and or taking my hand and putting it on their genitals. That to me is a very clear violation of consent. And there was zero kind of, questioning or zero kind of nuance. It was like, I want you to do this thing and I'm going to make you by moving your hand or your head to do what I want without asking. So there's like that bucket that to me, that is very clearly not regret. Like it's a very clear, like, opportunity to kind of have this conversation around boundaries and around consent and those kinds of things. And then there's kind of this idea of like, ooh, like that was just like not good. Like that maybe we didn't like have the kind of conversation during or after that like made me feel good. But and that maybe falls into this like regret kind of bucket. And then it also, I feel like there's feedback specifically from cis men around like, well, I don't even know like if I can have sex with this person because I'm like worried about like messing up consent. And I think that falls into that second bucket of this, like, because we're not having a nuanced conversation around consent equaling pleasure, equaling opportunity, equaling connection, right? It kind of is falling into this like regret, scared, inability to even like to engage with another person in this way because of the potential of men being seen in that first bucket. That to me is how I'm separating these things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's, I would add to that first bucket, like bringing up blue balls, saying I hate condoms, like we all hate condoms. Like when people say that.
Some people like them. I don't know. Some people like condoms.
I mean, very, in my experience, it's been, just like, I'm like, you don't ever need to say that. Like, if I'm saying we're using a condom, I don't ever need to hear that you don't like condoms. I don't like them either. Like, what are you trying to do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, all of those things I would lump in with pressure, force, maybe light force, but like, yeah, if someone's like physically pushing you to do something with no, we're talking about lack of verbal consent and also not gauging any of your nonverbal information. And so I think what can happen is that like that first bucket becomes this like, that's like the fear bucket. Like we're all afraid of that bucket. And most men that I know don't want to be in that bucket. And even men that I know now as adults who like will be honest, like they'll say like, I used to be in that bucket because I didn't know. I didn't know how to ask. I didn't know. I thought that was what I was supposed to do. Like I didn't know. And they feel immense regret. And now they're in that second camp where they're like, I'm afraid to even like talk to people or like ask for anything because I'm so afraid to pressure people. I'm so afraid people can't say no to me. Or the version that's like, I don't want to get in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, what I'm referring to that breaks my heart is the collapse of the two, where the first bucket is something that we absolutely have to address and try to eradicate. It's not okay. But I also think we have to eradicate it with compassion, without shame, without guilt, because we're not doing a good job of educating people on how to ask for what they want, on how to have these conversations. We're also showing them abysmal examples in the media of like, how to have sex and engage in romance and dating and sex. And I think, we can't create we don't want to create a group of men in particular who are then like, hate themselves and like can't move on with their lives, can't forgive themselves. But yeah, the part that really breaks my heart is when these sort of instances where that was not what was going on. And someone is just sort of like, I shouldn't have had sex with that person. And they're like, how do I make this not my fault?
Yeah. Yeah. Very tricky. Very tricky.
Yeah.
I'd love to move on to talk about kind of what this season is all about, which is about the connection piece and about the pleasure and about the intimacy. Mm-hmm. And, while also holding kind of all the nuance that we just discussed and holding, the fact that we want people to engage in pleasurable, fun sexual experiences that are not always going to be that 100% of the time because we're people and emotions come up and things are challenging. But my hope is that with consent education, we can teach people as best we can how to engage with consent and the intersection of pleasure and connection. So could you maybe talk a little bit about what that looks like in your education and how people can kind of associate consent with pleasure?
Yeah. Well, I have found, originally, much to my surprise, that the more that I was learning about consent, the more like flow opened up for creativity. And then I started getting that same feedback from students in my classes and people I was working with one-on-one. I mean, people would say like, I've been trying to like reconnect with my love of painting or music or whatever for years. And this class on consent and boundaries, like opened something up for me. And now I can't stop. I'm like obsessed. I had a similar experience. Like I literally learned to make music like in tandem with learning about consent, and I think it's absolutely connected. And now the majority of my work is focused on working with artists, particularly working with artists on like moving through creative blocks and building discipline without punishment, building structure, listening to whatever comes, being willing to try and fail, make mistakes, try again, learning how to collaborate. All of these I think are can come back to consent-based questions. So I had started to notice this relationship between consent and creativity pretty early on in 2020. And then a couple years later, a client of mine recommended a book called On Connection by Kay Tempest. I had known, like, I was like, someday I'll write a book. And I had the idea to write a book, like really concretely. Like I was like, I think I like know where I want to go with this. And then a few months later, I read On Connection. I literally opened the table of contents, read the table of contents, closed the book, and started writing my own book. Like that was how inspired I was. And this is a book all about creativity as like moments of connection. And you could call connection like relationships between things, like the meeting between different things, whether it's like a connection between like you and me, or like me and my body, or me and the sky, or me and my garden, or whatever. So Kay talks about like fostering connection. They talk about like craft being the thing that you build and hone while you're waiting for connection or inspiration to strike. We have to sort of be in the practice in order to be ready when inspiration comes. And the thing in consent that offers like a really beautiful jumping off point for this is actually from the Fries model. It's specificity. So the S in Fries is specificity. And when it comes to consent in sex, specificity is, I think of it as a creative challenge. Saying to someone like, can I touch you? So vague. I don't know where, how, like with what, But if you say, can I touch you? Can I squeeze your butt and jiggle it? Will you get on top of me and like go limp so that I can squeeze your butt and jiggle it? Like, oh my God, that's so much more fun. It's so much more interesting. I can go, yeah, like I know exactly what you're asking for. I can give myself to you completely. You can go for it completely. That's so freeing. Like I think that people often think that consent is going to be really constraining, really constricting. It's going to be rules. It's going to make me feel like I unsure and like a robot. But in reality, when you're practicing consent this way, you have to be more creative, and you get to watch someone else like express their desire really creatively with you. And you get to surrender. You get to also like, you can surrender to the other person, but you can also like fully give, if you get really clear permission to do something, then you don't have to do it timidly. You can really go for it. And you can still ask like, is this still okay? Are you still enjoying this? Is this too hard, too soft, too fat, But like you really, permission is really liberating. And then the way that translates into art is like, I mean, just the example of like being given a prompt versus no prompt. Like if someone's like, can you write a 800 word essay for me? And you're like, I get, yeah, you will likely freeze and, panic may set in depending on who you are. Like, what do you want though? Like, what are you asking for? Whereas like, if you say to someone, can you write me 800 words on the relationship between consent and creativity? Yes. Okay. Now I know where to go. Like now I have this really beautiful structure that I can play within. So that's really helpful in sex. It's really helpful in art. And I find that the more you learn how to build those structures for yourself, the freer you feel to play.
This is fascinating. So a lot of this, it sounds like, at least from these two examples that you're giving, comes from communication and being very detail oriented with the kind of communication that you're seeking. I'm trying to think of how maybe this would apply. Like how does it apply for your music? Because I also am a musician, I'm a singer.
Great.
And I'm curious, like how do you see the connection there?
My background in theater is largely in what's called devised theater, which is like a non-hierarchical, collaborative, like ensemble-based approach to like building a theater piece. And when I started taking guitar lessons in 2019, my teacher and I discovered that we both had this shared background in theater, like devised theater specifically. So we started applying those methods to making music. So I started like I had done this writing project years ago where I was writing letters to myself at 16. And I had this idea for a concept album to like pull lyrics from those letters. I had these mix CDs I had made throughout high school. And so I was like using those as source material and, putting them in conversation with each other. And whether I was like using the chord progressions or the instrumentation, the arrangement, the structure, like whatever. And what I've found is that the practice of consent, this idea of like deep listening, the main consent-based shift in art making is moving from the question, is this right? Am I doing this right? Or is this good? To, do I like it? Or how does this feel? So that shift, I mean, if you apply that to sex, you can think about like how nerve-wracking the question, like, am I doing this right? Or is this good? That's a very, very easy to fall into people pleasing there, where you're trying to guess how the other person is feeling or what they want. You're not really checking with yourself. During sex, if you're asking yourself, like, do I like this? How does this feel? Or how does this feel to you? Are you enjoying this? As opposed to like, am I doing a good job?
Right.
Like that's a really constraining question. The question, how does this feel? Or are you enjoying yourself, to yourself or to other people, is really freeing, and it gives you a lot more information. So in your art, it's so debilitating to ask yourself, is this good? Is this song good? I don't really care personally. Do I like this song is a much more compelling question. And, what do I like about it? And what am I most proud of? And then even like as a consumer being like, what do I like about this song? How would I do it differently? How does it make me feel? What would be my take on it? Like those are questions that allow for a lot of expansion.
Yeah. And I really like thinking about, pleasure as the measure. It's something Dr. Emily Nagoski says. And I think that it applies when we're thinking about consent and creativity and thinking about pleasure and how good things feel and how to really basically, a lot of this is kind of like rudimentary connection to your body and figuring out like, how do I feel when I touch myself in this way, when someone else touches me in this way? What kinds of things feel most exciting or daring or interesting or edgy to me? And so I think it's a real investigation of the self before it even becomes anything else.
Exactly. I do want to bring this back. Emily Nagoski talks about responsive desire, and responsive desire is yet another it very much in conflict with this requirement of enthusiasm. When someone has responsive desire, and I sometimes do, like if someone wants to have sex, it's less a question. I'm not always asking myself, like, am I horny right now? Do I want to have sex right now? I'm like, how would that feel? Like, would I enjoy that? And like, usually the answer is yeah, I will probably enjoy that. But enthusiasm in this exact moment is not really there, you know? And especially like in a long-term relationship, you know, a lot of sex is like, do you want to have sex? And the answer is like, sure. You know, which is like, you know, I hear what you're saying, and I agree that like when you're having sex with someone new for the first time, like you want to make sure that everyone is, you don't want, like, you should not be like shaking in the corner. Like, I hope that's obvious. But I just think that there has to be like such a wider range of like what we are willing to accept as like fully present consent. And then to take this into the realm of connection and creativity, so much of art making is not enthusiastic. You know, I'm a writer. So much of writing is like, I have to write today because this is due. And I'm just going to stare at this blank page until something comes out of me.
Right.
And so it's really about, it's about building the structure. It's about like setting up the circumstances, and it's about showing up. It's not, and then a lot of people mix up discipline with punishment. You know, you don't want to be punishing yourself, and you should never. I wrote this piece about the two kinds of sex that I don't want. One kind of sex that I don't want is where I like the emphasis is on I don't want it, right? I don't want to, I absolutely have zero interest. There's no part of me that wants to do that. I'm not willing to do that. I absolutely don't want to. Then there's the kind of sex that I don't want, the emphasis on want, being like, I don't, in this moment, I'm not turned on. I'm not horny. I'm not like, I really, really, really want to have sex right now. But I, you know, and like, maybe this is not so much for teens and people like, you know, in their sexual debut, but I'm thinking about kink, where people are in, they like feeling useful, or they like feeling used, or they like humiliation, or they like, you know, I have a friend who says like, use me like a fleshlight, you know, like these feelings around sex that are not quite a hell yes, but more based in like I really enjoy when my partner, like there, it takes so much trust to let someone, you know, I'll quote my friend, like use me like a fleshlight. I have to trust you so much. And to me, that trust is really romantic and really intimate and really vulnerable. And it's not sex that I'm having for like the physical pleasure or the hell yes of it. It's sex that I'm giving you like as a gift that makes me feel really connected to you.
Yeah, it's really all encompassing. It's like about the connection. It's about the pleasure. It's about the intimacy, the trust, the communication. That's what makes really excellent sex, is people being able to communicate that and, you know, open themselves up and take risks with someone they trust in order to make sure that they're kind of achieving their full like pleasure potential, essentially. But yeah, this is all really fascinating. I really like that we have these, you know, it's very rare that I have someone come on the podcast where we're kind of like talking about things in a little bit of a different way. And so I do really appreciate your perspective and your nuance and, you know, with this deeply intimate topic. So I'm so appreciative of you coming on and sharing your expertise. Where can people find you if they want to learn more?
I'm on Instagram at consent.wizardry. I have an account specifically for artists called magic.in.meaning. I'm vaguely on TikTok, not so much. And my website is consentwizardry.com, which is where you can sign up for classes. And I'm on Substack at It's Unsolicited Advice is the name of my newsletter.
Love it. Thank you so much for being here, Mia. This has been great.
Thank you.
And welcome to the Afterglow, where we wind things down, reflect on big takeaways, and leave you with one juicy thing to try, think about, or explore before next week. So, deep breath. This conversation was a doozy. First and foremost, thank you for listening, especially if you're this far. And thank you for sticking around as I add more perspective and nuance to this episode. I think we still have a lot to unpack here. Here are some things that Mia talked about that I agree with. Consent is a conversation. It's something that should be treated with care, nuance, and as much back and forth as you can give it. Consent violations can and do happen to men, and can be perpetrated by women, and trans folks of countless different genders too. Consent shows up in other types of collaboration, like artistic collaboration, and we don't talk about that enough. I did like that perspective. However, I did leave this conversation still disagreeing with a lot of what they had to say. It was difficult to hear Mia talk about men in the public eye who have been quote unquote canceled and suggest that they might have not done anything wrong. Let's go back to the Amber Heard example I brought up in the intro. The way that we talk about women who come forward when they're abused is incredibly harmful. Acting like women are making up consent violations or trying to find ways to justify punishing men for something they just regret doing keeps other victims silent. And of course, men can have their consent violated, and that's probably happening much more than we even realize. That is tragic and it's scary, and consent violations aren't less bad just because someone is in a more privileged demographic. A violation is a violation no matter who it happens to or who it's done by. But we also can't deny the fact that right now, in the US and in most Western countries, we are consistently told that women's consent does not matter. Men are still encouraged to coerce women. And think about how many movies that there are where a man wins over a woman just by not relenting until she finally says yes. The Notebook immediately comes to mind. And there are still movies like that today. Women are also far less likely to be believed about just about anything. With trans and queer people, this can be even more difficult. Hopefully, if you're listening to this podcast, you have a basic understanding of what the patriarchy is and what rape culture is. To me, acting like these are not truths of the world we live in is disingenuous and harmful. Right now, it's a devastating truth that there is very, very little to be materially gained by coming forward about an abuser. There is a ton to be gained emotionally, and hopefully coming forward can keep other people safe. But we know how law enforcement treats women who come forward about consent violations. We know how difficult they are to prove in a court of law, and often because of the rhetoric that Mia used in this episode. And we know how expensive legal representation can be if it gets to that point. Enthusiasm is an imperfect word for a type of feeling that can look so many different ways to so many people. That is true. But an acronym or any other quick model or platitude is not the start and the end of a conversation around consent. They're a jumping off point. They're a way to quickly check in with yourself and your partner. They're a framework for you to define what those terms mean for you and for each other. Only you can define what enthusiasm means for you. What's important is that you're always asking yourself if you're really truly okay with what you're consenting to, or if you're only saying yes because you feel like you were supposed to. If someone is trying to make you do something you don't want to do, that is not how consent works. If someone is asking you to try something you might not be into and you feel ambivalent, but you're down to give it a shot, that's fine. And yes, sometimes you can realize that your consent was violated long after the event took place. This doesn't usually happen because someone just regrets something and wants to put the blame on someone else. Sometimes it happens because you didn't realize you were allowed to withdraw consent until you learned that yes, you absolutely are. Sometimes it happens because in the moment, all you can do is tell yourself that it's fine, and arguing or fighting back would make everything worse. This was a really difficult conversation. Hopefully you can hear it in my voice that I'm very, very passionate about this. And the fact that people like Mia and other folks do espouse this harmful rhetoric pisses me off. And that's why I'm talking about this. I think I could have easily buried this conversation and not aired it. And I don't know that that's how we make progress. Even though this is hard, this is challenging. I hope that you left this episode, or you leave this episode feeling like you understand your stances on consent better. And I hope that it challenged you in ways that don't feel like they're damaging. Please check our show notes for some resources and check in with yourself too. If you have any thoughts on this episode, more now than ever, I'd really love to hear what you have to say. You can email me at sexedwithdb@gmail.com. Yes, I really do read every single email that I get. All right, let's take a deep breath in and out. Thank you for listening. Now let's get to our pleasure practice of the week. Think about what enthusiasm means for you. Is there a better word to describe the feeling of being interested in something because you're really interested versus feeling like you should be interested? Are you a yay kind of person? Or are you more like, yeah, sure? How do you define what that line is for you? And how do you communicate what that looks like to your partner? Truly, truly, thank you for trusting me with this. Thank you for listening. Love y'all. Talk to you next week.